Assalamu alaikum, comrades. I want to address a topic that's been increasingly relevant within the online communist movement, the concept of performing communism. What does a good communist look like? What do they do? How do they do it? What is their methodology? How do you measure how effective they are? Who are those fake communists? And so on. Perhaps much of this video will be speaking more to fellow and potential communist or leftist creators and those very involved in these online spaces. So please send this video to your favorite Marxist creators so they can take a listen and contribute to this discussion. So I need to start this by addressing the criticism. As a historian whose goal is to humanize the past, the people of the Soviet Union, communists who got us here to where we are today, because of how I go about that and the way that I look, I frequently receive messages accusing me of not doing enough, doing things wrong, not taking strong enough ideological stances. Of course, the accusations of cosplay and LARPing. Not that LARPing's a bad thing. Cosplay and LARPing takes skill and creativity and confidence. But there's this idea that because of those things, I'm not contributing seriously to the movement. A lot of that stems from a misunderstanding of what I do. And admittedly, this whole video was provoked by a particularly long comment I received yesterday. No hate to that individual. You spurred some inspiration and it was something that I receive all the time. It wasn't a unique comment. And this is an opportunity to address some of those concerns, have a serious discussion about this topic, which I feel is lacking, and really ruminate on the state of things. Let me find that comment. Okay, so here's what I received. When will you take a stance against revisionism and talk about Marxism? Getting past aesthetics. How do we form a party? This is a question not asked or answered in a single time in the history of your account. What is communist about this? If you claim to be a communist, you should provide your viewers with communist content, which consolidates or expands our movement. For now, you produce lowest common denominator content to get all the communists watching, not wanting to upset the Trotskyists or Maoists. This is not the way of Marx, Engels, or Lenin. Now, I did respond and it kind of went over their head. And honestly, one of the nicer comments I receive. But if you want my opinion, it might disappoint you. Unity among communists is more important than alienating specific subsets within our movement. Infighting and drama only serve to divide us and impede our progress. We should remember that our strength lies in our solidarity, not in tearing each other down. And I suppose I feel a bit silly saying that because look at the state of things. How many communist parties are in each of your countries? Probably a lot, and they disagree on a lot of frivolous things. New parties pop up, they come and go, all of them marred by their own different pasts and decisions, and none of them letting each other live down every mistake they've ever made. And the same could be said about individuals. Is feeding into that really what's going to make a good communist? A good movement? I don't know. Probably not. The primary role that I choose to take on is to provide historical context. I'm not particularly here to teach Marxist theory in depth. It's not my strong suit. There are, however, countless accounts and resources out there that do provide that. My focus is on humanizing history, showcasing the everyday lives, clothing, and items that tell the story of that past. This helps counter stereotypes, which have reduced the history of communism to mere caricatures of villains in popular media and beyond, which I believe is a real serious issue. There's a deep-rooted misunderstanding in what we look like, act like, what the history is. There's a bias in the telling of that history, at least in the English language, and at least one person trying to combat that specific thing is surely useful. And I do want to take this time to say, if you feel that there is something missing in the content that you consume, especially concerning theory or revisionism, I really encourage you genuinely to create your own content. We always need more voices in this. Each of us have unique strengths and insights, and it's unrealistic to expect few individuals to cover everything comprehensively. If you have a solid grasp on theory or a specific topic, you're good at articulating that, please contribute by making your own videos or writing articles. Your voice matters and is valuable. But let's go more into the humanizing of that history of communists in general, who we are, what we look like, where we have been. Humanizing history and incorporating elements like aesthetics is integral to teaching the full picture. When history is reduced to dry recitations of theory, we miss out on the vibrant, multifaceted reality of those past societies. Fashion history, social history, living history, they're often very devalued, yet they play a crucial role in understanding the human experience. Me doing my makeup in a historically accurate manner with historically accurate products may seem silly and frivolous, but it's something someone did every day in the past. There's a connection there. We need to question why we see these things as lesser. I think some of it does have to do with misogyny. Some of it is ego, wanting to appear more professional. I'll get to that. But I think a lot of the reason why we view dressing up and reenacting as something childish or less legitimate, probably because we associate a lot of that with negative stereotypes of women. But that's a bigger discussion in itself. I'm not saying you need a framed portrait of Stalin at your 1940s vanity, but it does make things more fun. It sparks my creativity and passion. It's a little bit whimsical too. Forgive me for having joy. Living history is an interactive method of historical interpretation, one where individuals might dress in period-appropriate clothing, adapt a lifestyle, behaviors, activities of that specific historical era or event, and it's a common and legitimate method used in museums, historical sites, and reenactment events. It enhances your learning by engaging all of your senses. It fosters empathy and a deeper connection for the people who lived before you through those times, allowing us to understand their challenges and achievements. This outfit's a little inspired by Alexandra Kollontai. This picture, I need to get a matching hat for this coat. I'm really inspired by the brave communists that came before me, who risked it all in revolution, war, strikes, the successful ones and the ones that weren't, bravely fighting off Nazi invaders. Emulating them in small ways satisfies something deep and meaningful inside me. It's a constant reminder of the bigger picture and what we're fighting for. Does that make me a bad communist? I prefer to teach in a way that showcases humanizing stories, little-known facts, and visuals that are often misunderstood or misrepresented in the English retelling of those stories. The nitpicking and selectiveness. We must combat that dehumanization and gross caricaturization of the history. We can take back that power in presenting that past more vibrantly. As communists and Marxists, it's important not to get caught up in rigid expectations of what we should be. We should resist the pressure to conform to standards set by traditional academia. History doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to be men in suits reading theory monotonously. Education can and should take many forms, reflecting the diverse ways people learn and engage with information. Why are we living by a standard, a system that we know is wrong and corrupt? We talk about the flaws in it all the time, yet conform to it completely? Make it make sense. So yeah, ironically, while I receive comments about my LARPing and cosplaying, many of us engage in a performance of our own. We try to fit into this mold of what we think a serious academic, historian, or communist looks like. Serious, stern, devoid of artistic expression. This is a form of performance in itself, rooted in traditional expectations. This morning I had a really big and serious conversation with one of my best friends, Susan. Please follow her on TikTok and YouTube. She talks about China. She's in China right now. She's fantastic. There's this much bigger issue in society right now. I think there's a lot to be said about how younger and newer generations are losing the ability to express themselves or to have unique thoughts and opinions, and how we're not gaining the skills to present or find ourselves, or are terrified of risky perspectives. We can't healthily disagree with each other online in any sort of productive way. Everything is an offense worth attack. Always concerned about what other people think, the fear of being canceled or made fun of, or the accusations that come with it. I actually think a lot of this stems from the growth of use in like AI and ChatGPT, hang with me here, where people aren't forced to come up with their own ideas, their own perspectives or opinions. Everything becomes kind of broad and soulless, and again, void of risk-taking. We can't talk to each other. We don't talk to each other. People can't relate to even like a unique sense of style, self-expression, or extreme passion and love for things, like the passion of Soviet history and communism. What I do comes off as so far off and strange because we're slowly losing our ability to passionately love something care for something, connect ourselves to it with our personal reasons and a why. As our world becomes soulless and devoid of like the human spirit, we can't connect or understand one another. And then we project very surface level reasons onto that. They must be cosplaying, this can't be real, no one likes something that much, there must be something mentally wrong with them. We don't have true characters anymore. It's becoming more and more rare to find outgoing people with a presence and a spark. I'm often worried about who's going to be teaching our future generations when like no one is learning the skills to present and articulate and connect past ideas and histories to the present and ourselves, critical thinking and such. We aren't reading or listening to each other anymore, and everything keeps being created for entertainment purposes instead of substance. And we are intellectually and socially suffering. I don't know, maybe I sound like a boomer saying all of that, but it's been on my mind. But back to performance, because while we accuse others of performing or pretending from this more surface level, like I mentioned, soulless standpoint, in reality, we're all in a performance of our own, even when you don't dress up like me and decorate your house this way. I want to talk about Judith Butler's performative theory. Her idea states that everything we do is a social performance, whether we are reinforcing or rejecting social expectations. Those who criticize others for not fitting the mold of a serious communist are themselves performing a role that they believe to be natural. They replicate what they subconsciously perceive as the correct way to present themselves. And I want to give some examples of this performative theory. Let's start with appearance and attire. The expected performance, by some standards in my comment sections, would be that a respectable communist is imagined to wear plain, functional clothing, avoiding anything seen as frivolous or luxurious. Bourgeois, right? And I've talked extensively about how that's not the case and how it's problematic to view communists, especially like of the Soviet Union, as bland, only wearing gray, whatever. But that's not the point. The reality of this performance is that this austerity visually communicates ideological purity, but it's very limiting and exclusionary. There's been communists all over the world from many different cultures with many different ideas and sense of style. We simply can't say communists can only dress one way, especially if that one way isn't accessible to the working man. Then there's language and demeanor. The expected performance would be that a respectable communist speaks in a serious, authoritative manner, talking in theoretics and often complex language. But this intellectual rigor can alienate newcomers or those who prefer a more accessible communication style. It's one of my biggest gripes with traditional academia, is this idea to talk and make things complex solely for the purpose of being taken seriously. It's not actually helping anyone understand anything or learn anything better. You're not really explaining it to the common man who needs to know these things. It's all ego-driven. It's I want to appear important and academic, so I'm going to complicate it for literally no reason other than other people might respect me more. It's ridiculous. And as I mentioned, inaccessible. It makes me angry. Then there's lifestyle choices. The expected performance here would be that a true revolutionary should lead a life of modesty and self-sacrifice, rejecting modern conveniences. But this lifestyle performance, while it embodies socialist values, it creates unrealistic standards. There's public activism. One should be visibly and actively engaged in protests and direct action. But then this undervalues behind-the-scenes contributions like research and community support. Culturally, a respectable communist should embrace only politically conscious art. Insufferable, I know. Politically conscious music and literature. But this cultural performance creates a narrow view of acceptable behavior in the movement. And we all know that we need escapism. It's okay. Read your fan fiction. I'll throw in one more. Emotional expression. The respectable communist is stoic, unyielding, maybe showing little emotion. A real leader there. But this performance disregards the need for emotional expression and connection. Being emotional and passionate does not make you a bad leader or a worse communist. It shows you care. So by examining these examples through the performance theory, we really see that rigid expectations of what that respectable communist should be are actually socially constructed performances. These performances aim to conform to an idealized view, but exclude and marginalize those who don't fit those molds. And obviously we're not all the same, with the same set of conditions. Embracing a broader and more inclusive understanding of what it means to be a revolutionary allows for that greater diversity and strength within the movement. Now, one of the comments that guy said to me earlier that kind of got to me was that I'm not walking down the path of Lenin. Well, no, I would consider myself more walking down the path of Anna Louise Strong, my greatest inspiration and idol, someone who constantly wrote about the misunderstood communist nations through storytelling and travel. And even in her time, she dealt with much of the same issues. For reference, she died in the 1970s, and her heyday was probably like the 30s through 60s. Let me share with you one of my all-time favorite quotes of hers. She wrote, "I find it harder and harder to write or lecture on the USSR. Nobody would accept a human picture, that the USSR is a state with state's organs and functions, and informed with certain great aims and tasks in history. The USSR had to be either a devil or a deity. The one side would not admit a single virtue, the other side would not admit a single flaw. The people I really cared for, on whose side I felt myself to be fighting, they winced, so if a single human weakness in the USSR were noticed. So I let my audiences pressure me into giving what I knew was a partial picture. I told no lies, but I didn't tell the whole truth. And I still think this may be the correct procedure." She wrote that in a letter to Raymond Robbins on October 26th, 1950. Essentially replaced the USSR in this quote with communism or communists in general. I think the way that she expresses these extremes, no one would accept a human picture, it carries into communists today. They have to be perfect. They have to, well, not even perfect by a set rule of standard, it's your own individual standard, right? You have an idea of what the perfect communist looks like and how they should act and present themselves, and a slight deviation from that, you end up completely rejecting. But the reality of this quote and this way of thinking that she's pointing out is that it's showing the major flaw in the world communist movement at that time, something that carries today. It's always extremes, extreme perfection or complete cancellation. Where is that room for the human picture? It's certainly not here. I get bullied every day for it. But back to Lenin, because it's curious that people bring up Lenin. Walk in the footsteps of Lenin. You're not walking in the footsteps of Lenin. Lenin would hate you. Stalin would gulag you. Maybe. And you'd probably cancel both of them. Lenin, too, was human. Well, that we're aware of. One who joked, had fun, promoted new ideas and ways to get the masses involved in the communist movement. In the memoirs of a shoemaker named Kammerer, with who Lenin stayed with in Zurich, we read that Lenin did not care much for his appearance. He quotes, "Comrade Lenin was distinguished by his extraordinary simplicity. Both he and his wife did not attach any importance to good clothing and good food. They paid me 28 francs a month. In winter, I had to make them a pair of heavy peasant shoes with large nails. Comrade Lenin, I told him, with these shoes you will be mistaken for a peasant elder." He laughed, but continued to wear these shoes throughout the winter. Now, this would be a story that came up throughout the 1920s and 30s in articles about Lenin and his life and his character to inspire the masses. One instance I can find is the article called Lenin as a Man, published in 1924. And of course, this story has ideological undertones. The leader of the proletariat could not be presented as a dandy of his time. But we also see that Lenin could joke and care less about his appearance. He dressed in a way that was relatively common for young intellectuals at his time, yet he was not bothered by the idea of other people making fun of him. You see, Lenin made room for ideas, and even the dreams he didn't fully agree with. He supported artist movements, constructivism. The Soviet Union quickly became a hotspot for it, even when it was considered impractical. And when the everyday person ultimately couldn't connect with this form of art, they moved on to something new, socialist realism. It was always changing. They were always trying something new. Another instance off the top of my head, with Kollontai. He supported the right for her ideas to be expressed, even when he didn't completely agree with them, like on her concept of free love. Of course, there were many discussions on what the new Soviet person's personal life should look like, what the life of a communist should look like. That's what they were discussing in this time. What should be tried, accepted. Again, something that would change a lot through the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s beyond his death. Always something new, always stretching the limits and the imagination of the new Soviet people. What I'm trying to say is that rather than limiting what a communist or an educator should look like and act like, we should have more revolutionary optimism and an open mind for trying things out. Okay, but also, I'm often wondering, like in the modern day, how would we react to people like Lenin? To brash women like Louise Strong, who again made people uncomfortable even in her day? Would we nitpick and destroy each other? Do that to them? In the same way that we do to ourselves and online. How long would Lenin last on Twitter before he was doxxed and completely made fun of to the point of no return? It sounds ridiculous saying it out loud, but the reality is, I think we would try to destroy them. Look at us. There's so much room in experimentation in how we present and teach history and ideology. The Soviet Union, after all, was one big experiment, the first attempt at creating a socialist society. Some things worked, some did not, but we learn from them. We learn from trying new things, new approaches. That's the whole point in studying the past, learning from it. How would we progress if we didn't try and make mistakes and sometimes not make mistakes? You know what I'm saying? Sticking to what's just expected or garners respect will only stifle our innovation in learning. And is being respectable to the West what we should aspire to if we are creating something new, teaching people ideas that were new in their time and brought great inspiration? Should that be stifled to a very specific way and look? Surely there are limitations and boundaries. There's always going to be outliers and extremes, and not in the innovative way. I'm of course not necessarily addressing all of that, the what ifs and crazy examples. Like maybe you should wear some clothing. Not everyone would be super for a nudist branch of the communist movement, but who knows? We'd have to try. Obviously I joke, but you get what I'm trying to say. New secret Izdihar fetish unlocked. Another thing I've been thinking about, and like a way to explain this, which might resonate with you, is how it reminds me of a child who like kind of knows what his dad does for work, but not entirely. Like he has a little bit of an idea of what that means and looks like. Let's say his dad works at a power plant. So he imagines his father sitting there vaguely at a desk with a lot of buttons and alarms. But the rest, the reality of the complexity and enormousness of this kind of job, he fills it with imagination because he just doesn't understand or know yet. He creates a magical image of that in between for what he doesn't yet understand. And we do that now with creators online, with historical figures, with ideology. And instead of, when presented with that reality, new information that fills those gaps, what this person is really like, what their job entails, their more human opinions and likes and dislikes, instead of changing that image in our head that we've created to include those new aspects, we become enraged by the idea that our fantasy has been cracked. You are no longer how I imagined or want you to be. How dare you? And resentment and negative emotions, they fester and project outwards. That's how I see a lot of this. Some of my biggest haters were once people who would routinely ask me to marry them. Then they learn more about my personality, and now they lead campaigns against me. It's interesting how that works. Fantasy cracked. You're an evil degenerate. So in recent times, we're witnessing like this resurgence in the Red Scare. It's some of my favorite old propaganda. It's certainly not as stylish as it used to be. I know, I'm focusing on the important stuff. But with this resurgence and fear, new fear, continued fear of communism, this atmosphere of paranoia can be divisive, sowing distrust and encouraging infighting between our ranks. I think it's more important than ever now to foster this unity within our movement, to limit internal gripes. Solidarity, after all, is our greatest, weapon against external threats and internal decay. Surely you see that. Let's conclude. I'm just yapping forever. I'm not sure if I'm even making sense. But yes, concluding thoughts. We should embrace the diverse ways that we engage with and teach about communism. We need to support each other in our efforts, recognize that there's not one single correct way to perform communism. By valuing different approaches and contributions, personalities even, we strengthen our movement and enrich our understanding of the past and present. It's also okay to disagree with one another. It's okay to disagree with me. I'm not claiming to be the figurehead of any movement. I'm not the ultimate supreme leader here who knows exactly how to do everything. And please don't follow people who act like they are. I think that's a really surefire way to guarantee they're not fit for that. So we've really lost this revolutionary spirit and revolutionary optimism. We're becoming cruel and mean. Sometimes you need to be a little mean to each other, hold each other accountable, set them straight, be blunt, but we're not doing that in any real constructive way. We are holding people to ridiculous standards that we tend to make up on the spot and haven't necessarily thought through. All that does is scare people away from the movement, scare people away in general, prevent them from bringing in new ideas, new thoughts to the table and contributing. It limits those of us who are already here, trying to educate, get people interested. We're always walking on eggshells, afraid of being attacked or canceled next. The constant accusations, direct messages, it's awful. I don't want to deal with it. I don't like dealing with it. But lucky for you, I've made myself unhireable in my field due to my internet presence, so you're stuck with me. Che Guevara had a great quote about this. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It's impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. He said that in his essay, Man and Socialism in Cuba. You need to have an open mind and an open heart. Revolutionary empathy is what I like to call it. Perhaps a topic for another time. But tell me what you think about this down below. Am I making sense? Again, sure, disagree, argue down below. I'll only cry a little bit. There's definitely more to be said on this as a whole, and I'd really love to hear what you have to say, what you've seen and experienced, or anything else that popped up in your mind as you listen to this. Please be inspired by history. Don't let the judgment of others, expectations from the flawed and broken system and society around you prevent you from being who you are and doing what you love. Life is hard, this world is difficult, and it's getting darker faster. But with that revolutionary optimism and inspiration of the past, of a better, brighter time, a time where those before us, with that light of communism, what it could bring and how it could better us all, we can really create something better and salvage what we have left. Thank you.